Okay, the YouTube live stream is up and cooking. So you guys all introduced yourselves while I was out?
No, on the end.
Okay, who wants to go next?
Go, Pascal.
All right, so my name is Pascal Wallisch, and I serve as a clinical associate professor at the Department of Psychology at NYU, and I'm passionate about neural data analysis. I co-teach a Coastal Harbor class summer course on neural data science, although it's been postponed because of the coronavirus. And so for that reason, I'm also very excited to be in the Neuromatch Academy here. I think it's a great effort, and I'm actually quite impressed by what was built here in quite a short time. And also disclaimer, I don't have any animals running around right now, but there is a storm coming, and I think so. If you hear any like thundering in the background, that's what that is. Hopefully, I will not be lost. Okay, the storm is here.
Hi, I'm also a big fan of what you guys are doing, so congratulations. And this is an exciting way that science brings the world together. Mike Shadlen, I've been studying decision making for a long time, and I'm a professor at Columbia University and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and the Zuckerman Institute. I have all kinds of like things that I do. Anyway, I'm passionate about decision making and hope that I can help these guys answer your questions. Let's have some fun.
Great. Anne and Athena, you guys go?
So, okay, so this is Athena. Athena Akrami. I'm one of the organizers at Neuromatch Academy, and I'm running a lab, a very young lab at Sainsbury Wellcome Centre, University College London, in London. And in the lab, we are trying to answer various aspects of decision making and learning, perceptual decision making and learning in the context of statistical learning, right? When we move around the environment, we experience sensory experiences, and we discover structures, meaningful structures throughout our experiences. How do we do that? And how we, in an unsupervised way, without explicit instruction and explicit reward, we learn about useful structures around us. We use animals, rats and mice, and humans, and we use models, normative models, and mechanistic models to try to understand those aspects of learning, memory, and inference better.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. So let me introduce myself quickly. I'm Shawn Escola. I'm an assistant professor at Columbia, and I am also one of the organizers and founders of the Neuromatch Academy. It's been a real fun ride over the past few months getting this set up for everyone, and I hope you guys are all having a really great time. So in my lab, we study the hidden states of the brain. We use both theoretical and data analysis tools to try to get at that. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk with you all. And before we get started, I'm just going to put the link for the reflections one more time in the chat. So please do fill that out. It's very important for us. And so why don't we go ahead and get started? We can get started with the very first question here. So how can we decide on the number of states when we try to use an HMM to understand the state transitions in neural populations? How can we decide whether we should use an HMM or something that imposes smooth transitions? Anybody want to take a swing at that?
I can start with the first part.
Sure.
So we talked about this earlier today already, but basically the idea is because you're inferring something from the data, something that might or might not exist. It is prudent to use Occam's razor, meaning like you want to assume as little or as few hidden state as possible, unless you're forced by the data to do that. Unless, and that's, I want to refer back to Sean's intro lecture, you have a reason to assume a certain number of states. So he mentioned sleep states where we know it's 5 if you include REM. And so you have a ground truth in that case, presumably. What do you want to infer? That's what I would say. So you want to jump in on that?
Sure, I'll add. I think that it's totally an open question whether the transitions between states might be smooth or abrupt. And also there's lots of instances where the brain is not in one of two discrete states, but in some mixture of the two. The example that we talked about this morning was the subject that a strategy uses on a particular task. And there might be multiple, or let's just say two strategies that a subject could use, and they could be engaged in the extreme version of one or the other, but oftentimes they use a mixture of strategies. And I gave the example of on a event-based task using a combination of the rate and the count. Maybe one more than the other. So there are multiple strategies at play. You could potentially decode those separately, but they aren't two discrete states. They're mixed together. So I think you shouldn't, I don't think one should necessarily always assume that the states are always discrete.
And of course, we did talk about that today because we looked at both discrete state-space models like the hidden Markov model and continuous state-space models like the Kalman filter. And there are, depending on the data that you're trying to model, depending on the experimental setup that an animal is engaged in, it might bias you to thinking about either discrete or continuous state spaces. I like this question here from Alan. Is there a way to validate whether a hidden state exists? This one's a little bit more up for philosophizing.
I can.
Yeah, Athena.
No, go ahead, Pascal.
Well, I was going to say that's the same approach like in the PCA. I mean, and I'll say this again, the same point came out this morning. This is a Platonic enterprise. We have the data, and it's noisy and full of imperfections, but it's data we have. But our philosophical approach here, just like in the PCA, is that we are saying, no, the data was generated by underlying perfect objects that live in the world of ideas. In this case, these perfect objects are the hidden states, and we have to infer them. Whether they're real or not, that's the consensus we came up this morning, is how much of the variance do they predict? And ideally, I think that's probably Athena was going with the cross-validation with manipulation. Like if you can bring about a certain outcome by changing those states, that's I think what we kind of came up with this morning, right? Shawn, Athena?
Mike has a comment.
Mike wants to say something.
Yeah, it's sort of at the philosophical level, but really, I think with bearing on the biology, which is that it's useful to think about the distinction in the brain, perhaps, between things that are adjustments of parameters, which are sort of part and parcel of the hidden states, versus a transition from one state to another, which probably involves a change in the way a circuit works. Okay, maybe even the recruitment of another circuit. So I think it's a useful and fun topic to think about whether or not we move a little bit in parameter space or whether we switch to a whole new set of parameters, or at least one that's qualitatively different enough that we want to call it another state. And that's a big area of development right now mathematically, but also I think it connects to the big mysteries in neuroscience of higher brain function, which is how does one part of the brain make a decision not to do something, but to change the way another part of the brain works.
That's really cool, Mike. And we got sort of to a similar place in this morning's conversation. And I just want to bring up what I brought up then, which is that I like to think about the different states in the brain as potentially involving different dynamics. And so when we think about how the Kalman filter, which has these continuous state spaces, and these HMM with these discrete state spaces, how these things might be unified in a certain setting, you can imagine that actually each of the discrete states is characterized by its own dynamics. And I think in the way that you were just framing it is sort of similar, that each state might have its own sort of set of parameters that can be changed on a micro scale. But then it's a bigger question of when do you want to throw that whole system out, recruit new circuits, and just operate in a different, with a different overall set of tools. Yeah, I appreciate that. So let's go to the next question. If I have a time series with different states and I don't know the transition probabilities or anything else about the data, how could it be Markovian, and how could I use an HMM? Could the HMM be used for any time series with latent states? Anyone want to take a stab at that? So I can go. No, go ahead, Athena.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I wanted to mention something that you also mentioned in the intro, so you can just directly expand on that.
Okay, well, we'll circle back to you. I think this is a good question to mention something that we didn't get to in the tutorials and in the lecture this morning, which is how you fit these models. So really, there's sort of two things that you can do with these state space models that have these hidden latent states. You can either use them with a set of parameters that you have some reason to believe to infer things about a system. And that's really what I think most of the day was about. But you can also try to figure out what are those parameters, what are the transition probabilities, what are the dynamics in of a continuous model. What is the way in which the data is generated given the state? Can you infer them from data? And so Pascal and I actually worked quite a bit over the past few weeks on trying to include more of that in the day, but frankly, at the end of the day, we had too much material and we weren't able to do that. So there are a bunch of tools that people can use in order to figure out what the state transitions are, even if you don't have a strong prior for what they should be a priori.
So I actually want to apologize to all of you right now before we do anything else, because even though we cut a lot of material, the feedback we've gotten so far is there was way too much, so I apologize. That's my fault. But Athena, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention one example maybe that might sound a little bit familiar to students is some of the works by Krishna Shinoy that you heard about, like monkeys doing this rich task, right? So they plan and they make an action. And so then if you look at the neural responses, for a lot of times, people were just like kind of artificially or manually, they were chunking these phases of planning and pre-movement and motor action from the neural data. But then in one of their work, they actually fitted a hidden Markov model to in a completely unsupervised way, let's say, pick up this transition in an automatic way, right? So it was not imposed by the experimenter when the planning is switching to pre-movement dynamics and how the pre-movement dynamics is now making transition into a real movement. It's just now you look at the neural dynamics continuous signal, but then the hidden Markov model is able to beautifully find these transitions and the smooth transitions from one state to another.
And I think that's a really nice example, Athena, about how these models, which don't actually intrinsically have mechanism built into them, can give us some insight of the kinds of things that we might want to look for in neural data to get some insight about how circuits implement these kinds of dynamics. Okay, let's go to Yona's question here. How do we know how much noise is acceptable for us to use when using an HMM?
Can I jump into that?
Sure, go for it.
I would like to say there's a brief two-part answer. One is it's not so much how much noise, but what kind of noise it is. Is it a Gaussian noise or is it some other kind of noise? And if it's Gaussian, then you can accept quite a bit of it. If it's not Gaussian, you might be in trouble, might want to use something else. But the second point, and I do think it's an important point to make, I, Pascal, am starting to not use terms like noise or error anymore, because who am I to judge it's noise or error? I think, for instance, Anne's work and other people here on the panel's work suggests that a lot of the things that we thought were noise, quote unquote, are actually just systematic variability we don't understand, particularly with these upstates and downstates. So I personally don't even use that term anymore. Mike?
Yeah.
I would take exception with that, if you don't mind, which is
Go ahead.
that I think where, of course, one person's noise is another person's unidentified signal. But yes, the thing is, we're studying decision making, or we're discussing it at some level anyway. And to that end, when an animal or us makes an error, even if it was because of some variability in that corrupted the signal and led you to be on the wrong side of a criterion and therefore made an error, or however you want to model the decision process, then for all intents and purposes, that variability, that unaccounted for variability that was mixed up with signal led to an error, should be called noise. It is the psychophysicist's noise, and it'll be quantitatively, right. Yeah, okay.
Sorry, Pascal. Just like it's true that it's the experiment. It's a noise from the experimental point of view, but probably it's not noise from the subject's point of view, right? So we really don't know what is going on in the mind of the subject. Subject is not. So that goes back to another question: how we are actually defining the number of states and how we are actually quantifying the behavior of the subject in the context. A lot of times we are imposing a set of states, as it's like we put the animal in a box, a rat or a mouse or a monkey, and then we ask the animal to engage into two alternative force choice tasks, and therefore we expect them to transfer the sensory stimulus into a final binary decision, and then we expect to explain all the neural variability based on these very kind of a constrained few states that we impose on the animal behavior. But at the same time, the animal is sitting there, is moving around, is probably doing a lot of daydreaming in the background in the mind, and that variability in the brain can explain a lot of these other states that we haven't included in our description of the behavior. So as like Anne has shown, if you start including more variable in the behavior by taking videos of animals movement and animals states throughout time, you can then explain a lot of the things that you yourself were cutting noise until yesterday because you were not measuring them properly. You start naming them some kind of an intuitive, meaningful term. No?
If I can jump in on, yeah, I can jump in on that. So I agree with Mike that if you knew that the task that you have the animal do is the task that the animal is doing from their perspective, then yes, you have an objective criterion. But like Athena just said, you don't know for sure what task the animal or the organism or the system thinks it's doing. So I actually have a paper coming out, shameless self-plug, where the system is actually behaving optimally if you recast what the system is doing. It's just not doing what you thought it was doing before. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no. I mean, yeah. Some of my works are also related to that, right? In a working memory task, right. If we expect the subject to only hold onto a specific sensory stimulus that we expect the subject to hold on, forget everything else, then the performance is worse compared to a condition that the animal is actually, or the human subject, is remembering a more longer term sensory experiences or statistics, which actually you can prove that that is the optimal way, but not according to the artificial way we are defining the
Let's ask Mike. Mike, how do you know what the animal is doing? What the animal is doing from their perspective?
You do a well-controlled study. You make sure that the animals you control the difficulty level. You make sure the animals perform perfectly when it's not difficult. So you know you have some control over their mistakes. You can interpret the mistakes as honest failures in some way. You measure the signal to noise, and then when you relate it to one quantity, say accuracy, you try to relate it to another, say confidence or reaction time. And if you can do all those things quantitatively and then complement it or test for it in the neurophysiology, I think you're pretty justified in saying that noise that you've been talking about as noise, even if it was caused by a bunch of things. I mean, in the end, it's a deterministic, actually, I don't think it's deterministic, but whatever. But it's a system that's a biological system. We don't really have to resort to quantum mechanics. And yet you will call it noise, and you ought to. And if you don't, then you're just breaking with a few hundred years of psychophysics and some, I think, very elegant neurophysiology of decision making, since you guys are teaching that section of this course.
I'm sure you guys are talking about the same kind of noise, actually. Like, I think I think, Mike, you're perhaps talking about noise at the level of the entire single trial response. Like, for example, some of the trials are a little bit higher and they lead to one outcome. Some of them are a little bit lower and they lead to a different outcome. And one might call those fluctuations noise in the sense that they sometimes disrupt a correct decision and lead to an incorrect decision. But I think there's noise on a different time scale, which is, I think, maybe the heart of what Pascal and Athena are talking about, which is that if you look at over the course of a single trial, as we all know here, looking at spike trains, they're hugely variable from trial to trial. Or if you look at calcium signals, they're just kind of fluctuating all over the place. And for me, I'll only speak for myself. Like when I first looked at our calcium traces, I really did think that the fluctuations we saw were noise. They were really reminiscent of the kind of single trial variability that was evident in electrophysiology data. But for that particular experiment, a lot of those fluctuations were not noise, they were driven by movements. And I think it's important, not because it's departing with psychophysics, I don't think it is, but I think without knowing what's driving those fluctuations, one might make the mistake of saying, oh, look how stochastic the brain is. That stochasticity is actually a strategy on the part of the brain to introduce randomness into the behavior or whatever, right? People have all kinds of ideas about what these the stochastic nature of neural firing might be used for. I don't include you in that group, Mike, but there's a lot of people that do think that. And so to point out, no, this isn't the outcome of some stochastic process in the brain. This is just the fact that the animal's fidgeting. It's important to know that. It puts kind of, it changes the amount of those single trial fluctuations that might be due to a stochastic process. We certainly didn't account for all of them. But it changes the amount of noise and fluctuations that are remaining that might be attributed to something other than signals that we've measured so far and might still be attributed to stochasticity of some kind.
Yeah, I mean, what Anne said. I mean, there is unquestionably some stochastic nature of this, but we don't know which is stochastic and which is systematic, but we don't know. You know, we can't tell which is which at this point.
And what about as just a modeling decision? If you're asking a specific question, and you could probably get there with a simpler model, but you recognize that you know more and that the system is variable in certain ways, you know, should we go ahead and build in those more complex features if you have some confidence to believe that you could fit them with your model?
Often not. Right? I mean, I think often we want to use really kind of the simplest models. It really depends on, I think, what your goals are, but I think there's a lot of value in really kind of simple conceptual models that account for a lot of features of behavior. They shouldn't be the only kind of model that they have, but I definitely think they have a really important place.
Like before, we don't do Occam's razor. It's just as simple as possible.
But to my mind, the experimental, I mean, I agree with everything Anne said, but I just would parse it a little bit differently. Yeah, it happens every now and then.
That's a premise, it's good. It's on video too.
I would have said that it was stochastic and it has lots of different contributions to the noise. And then it's an experimental question whether the fidgeting and the movements that introduce more variability, whether that variability is accounted for by the animal or whether that variability is able to sort of subvert the decision process and, you know, basically pretend that it is from the animal's perspective, not the experimenter's perspective. From the animal's perspective, it looks like just a corruption of the signal, and he doesn't know it's a corruption or he discount it, but it leads to an error. So I think it's fair to call that at least what the psychophysicists would have referred to as noise, and not part from Fechner on. And just say, well, some of that noise might have come from the animal moving, or maybe not. Maybe there's a generative model known to the animal, and you can factor it out. And that's where modeling comes in. We can ask that question experimentally, and we can parse the noise, as you well know, Anne, parsing noise, and figure out, you know, what is and isn't known by the animal. That which is not known and affects the decisions is noise to the psychophysicist and to the theorist.
Why don't we keep going? Because there's lots of questions here. I'm actually interested in giving a quick answer to the Alexander's question, which is, can we build HMMs with transition matrix that change dynamically over time rather than stationary ones? And this is something that I've worked on in the past. So there are models where you, instead of having a fixed transition matrix, you actually can make them conditional on some other features that you're modeling. So for example, you could have the transitions between different states be conditional on a history of spikes that a network has generated, or a history of stimulus features. And so those kinds of conditional hidden Markov models are a rich set of models that allow you to build more flexibility and get to something that in the marginal statistics are no longer Markovian, even though the conditional statistics are. I don't know if anyone else has any more to say on Alexander's question, or we can just move on. Charlotte asks, given that I have some brain signal and I know it contains some hidden states, think that's an interesting start. Okay, we'll assume that you know that it contains some hidden states. One, how can I define how many states I expect to be in the signal? For example, if I try an HMM with different number of states and state transitions, how do I know which model is the best? I think we tackled this morning. Anyone want to give another try?
So I can start. In terms of how many states there might exist in that neural dynamics, usually, as we also discussed today, tonight, and also earlier today, first of all, if you are trying to explain some behavior, you might have some sort of a intuition from the behavior that you're trying to explain, right? In order to define some specific states in the neural dynamic. For instance, if again the animal is engaged in a task that needs some sensory encoding, some memory component, some decision making, so you can kind of assume that like there is a state that is now is about the encoding of the sensory input, and then there is another state that can be the memory state, and then it can be a planning state and an actual execution of the action, right? So you can kind of intuitively, normatively try to define a set of states and then look for the correspondence in the neural dynamics. And in the second one, there are various ways that like you can basically put the number of a state as a kind of a parameter, a meta parameter in your model, and through different methods like cross-validation, you can then find the best number of states that would explain your data the best.
Using cross-validation is probably the simplest and most common way to get at the number of states, and probably works in the vast majority of cases. But you can also be Bayesian about it and use what are called infinite dimensional hidden Markov models, or non-parametric ones. And you can have a Dirichlet prior over the number of states, and then you can actually infer it from the data. So there are a handful of papers that look at this. Another question from Charlotte. Actually, let's go down to this next one. With perceptual decision making, we have drift diffusion model that can account for within trial mechanism brain. Can we have something like that in economic decision making? So reinforcement learning only describes learning on a trial by trial basis. I'm not sure exactly. Maybe does anyone have a sense of the question?
Yeah,
Mike has to answer that one.
well, no, I think I understand that question.
Yeah, he has to answer.
The idea is that I think the idea that's being expressed here is that the nice thing about models like drift diffusion are that they give you a single trial, insight into how the single trial is made. Same thing goes with signal detection theory and many other things. So drift diffusion is just one version of that. And then the question is, can it apply to problems in economic decision making? And the whole field of neuroeconomics, really pioneered by some economists and also Paul Glimcher, they has been studying that for a long time. And so behavioral economics and sort of behavioral microeconomics, many of these people, like I'm thinking of Antonio Rangel, if you want to go to literature, have studied have applied drift diffusion models to those types of problems with some success. But now, as neurobiologists, we might ask the question, what is really at the heart of a drift diffusion is that there is a set of pieces of evidence which are assumed to be independent, often identically distributed and independent, and there comes in some of these questions about noise again, and then they get accumulated until some threshold which reconciles how long it takes to make the decision with what decision is made. And that's in other words, explains speed versus accuracy and a lot of other things. But now the question is, what does one accumulate when one makes an economic decision? And that's an open question. So I don't think one accumulates noisy IID, independent, identically distributed random numbers, but rather I think one searches and thinks about problems and thinks about them in different ways. And I think that this is important. It's a break from drift diffusion, but it's not a break from the more general class, which is sequential sampling with optional stopping. Except, when those sequential samples come from memory, they might be very constructive. And if you're interested in economics, I think therein lies at least a clue, which I won't go on and on about, but a clue into why people seem irrational. and make all kinds of mistakes and failures of transitivity, they're constructing their evidence on the fly based on the way they approach the problem, and yet they still could conform to sequential sampling with optional stopping without necessarily being committed to the assumptions that lead to the mathematics of drift diffusion.
Can I jump in on that briefly?
Yeah, of course.
So
no one needs to ask for permission here, folks.
No, you're the moderator. You're the moderator. But I actually agree with Mike, believe it or not. And I think that it's fair to say that these models are being applied more and more. I know, for instance, of a case where people have applied it to judgments. So someone's listening to music, a song, and then how quickly can they make up their mind about the song? And it's apparently within seconds, and they're integrating emotional information, and this can be modeled, believe it or not, with a drift diffusion model. So this is increasingly widely applied.
Yeah, I'd like to add something to that too, actually. We're really having like a bring it all together moment, because I also sort of agree. But I want to also point out that kind of there's starting to be some cross-pollination in the opposite direction too, not just people in economic decision borrowing tools from perceptual decision making, but also the other way around. So the way we think about it in my lab is we think that, that when we think about a pure value task, the stimuli are all really known and clear, but the rules of the game are not clear, right? You're not sure how much a rightwards choice gives you versus how much a leftwards choice, because maybe those probabilities are changing. Whereas perceptual decision is kind of the opposite. The rules of the game are known, but the stimuli are kind of unclear. You're not sure if the dots were going to the right or the left, or the stimulus was high rate or low rate. But what we started to wonder is maybe from the subject's point of view, actually in perceptual decisions, maybe there is some uncertainty about the rules of the game as well. And that if we take into account that uncertainty and don't necessarily assume that the action values that the animal assigns to each side are stationary, that we might be able to kind of use some of those tools from economic decision making to capture features of perceptual decision making that were not really well understood before. So we've had a lot of fun playing around with this. Actually, it's work that hopefully is coming out soon. And one of the things we've really focused on is using this to understand disruption data that was previously kind of odd, and also lapses in decision making. Our human and animal subjects sometimes make errors on really easy trials, and we used to just view them as a nuisance, but now we start to view them as giving us insight into subjects having fluctuating action values, even though they're in a perceptual task. So I think that there's really cross-pollination going both directions.
Cool. Well, let's stay a little bit on this theme, and we have a couple more questions related to DDMs and so forth. Why don't we start with this one from Liu. Suppose one hopes to infer the true state that's unchanging across time via data using DDM. However, multiple true states are possible. Given that the sequential probability ratio test is no longer applicable for multiple alternative choices, what alternative paradigms can you use in this scenario? So more than a binary setting, what do we know about, what do we do in modeling, and what do you know about the brain, folks?
I think Anne and Mike definitely can comment on that.
Go for it, Anne.
Combination.
Yeah, I hope I heard all of the question. I was trying to find it, so I got all the answers. But yeah, so that's a really important point, right? Because in real life, we don't only make choices between two alternatives. We might make choices between more than two alternatives, many different choices, or we might make decisions that vary along a continuum, right? What direction am I going to ride my bike? That's not a discrete choice, it's a continuum. So yeah, when I was a postdoc in Mike's lab, we did a project together where we were looking at what happened to behavior and also to neural activity during a 4 and 8 choice version of the random dot motion task. And we found that we mostly focused on the 4 choice task at the level of the physiology. And we found that we were able to extend the existing model pretty well. We used multiple drift diffusion models because there were 4 choices instead of 2. And we noticed some interesting difference between the 2 and 4 choice versions of the task. We noticed that more evidence was accumulated on the 4 choice version, and also that the animals had less of an urgency signal to push the process to completion, maybe allowing for a little more evidence to be accumulated. There's also some theoretical work that's been on this subject, as well, some of it that inspired the direction that we took. I posted those in the chat this morning. I'll try and find them again and post those papers, post links to those papers. Or do papers get posted in the chat or Neurostar? Where do you guys want that information?
Yeah, we can do that. Sean, I mean, there's a request to post the chat in Neurostar. We can do that, right?
Oh, okay.
Sure. Actually, Anne, just a quick follow-up, because I don't know this. So one of the nice things about the SPRT is that we have very simple stopping criteria that are related to error tolerances. Do those carry over into the multi-choice setting?
Sort of, yeah. It was interesting that like one thing we expected, since we had hypothesized based on the behavior that more evidence was going to be accumulated for the 4-choice version of the task, like the reaction times were longer, for example. So one thing we thought would happen was that maybe the firing rate of the neurons at the end of the task would be higher, indicating a higher bound would be reached. But in fact, what happened instead is that they began the trial at a lower process. So maybe that would potentially allow for the same firing, for a larger firing rate excursion on a task where there's more choices without actually changing the height of that bound.
Mike, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with everything Anne said, of course. But the I want to just add a couple things that people that are new to this might want to know, which is that when you do the classic drift diffusion model, there's an upper and a lower bound, but the brain doesn't implement it that way. The brain implements it as a race between two diffusions, like one that favors A over B and the other that favors B over A. The critical thing about diffusion, of course, is that there can be positive and negative steps. You always have to think of accumulating a difference variable, and the mathematics of what makes SPRT work depends critically on the idea that you're accumulating a difference variable. In other words, a set of random numbers that have support in the negative and positive numbers, okay? In other words, you can get plus or minus steps. So in the brain, because it breaks it out into a race between two mechanisms, say something as simple as left versus right, then now it's possible to manipulate bounds, which implement the speed accuracy trade-off by what Anne said, by starting at a different point, or maybe even adding a time-dependent signal that I think, Anne, you coined the word, or urgency, making the time more costly. And that turns out to be normative in the world that Wald, who developed the SPRT test, that didn't think about. But according to the desiderata that Wald imposed or assumed, if you have a world where you have uncertainty about the reliability of evidence, the right thing to do is to collapse the bounds, or equivalently add a time-dependent signal to all the accumulators. I should just say, for people who want to get into the math, Rafael Bogatz has published lots of things on the multi-alternative extension of SPRT. And I would say one other thing, which is that just to plug a new thing that'll just kind of blow some people's minds, and you can think about it some more, is that if you're making two decisions, this is an experiment we're writing up right now, is if you make two decisions about one object, say color, is the dominant color blue or yellow, or is the dominant motion of the same thing right or left? What you find is that the brain does effectively two drift diffusions, which are again broken into effectively 4 races. But what it does, it does it completely serially. It can't do two at the same time. And we think that this basic architecture is the reason that brains are slow, that we're fundamentally serial. In fact, why conjunction search is serial, why we have a psychological refractory period. So I think the drift diffusion model or drift diffusion ideas inspired by the drift diffusion model are potentially, a good starting point for reasoning about a lot of cognitive processes. I would encourage you to think about it some more.
Does the brain do color or motion first?
It alternates, and interestingly, it alternates. In different people alternate and prioritize differently. We don't understand the prioritization problem, but we know that you split your time. You acquire in parallel, and then there's a bottleneck that keeps you from being able to update 2 decision variables at the same time.
Can they learn to have one more dominant or quicker than the other?
We think that it's possible, but we're trying to understand that in collaboration with Daniel Walpert, because then we have control over 2 different hands to answer questions. But so far, everything we do, including, we think possibly even same different tasks, take longer because you're actually making 2 decisions and you can't do it at the same time. I mean, the times are so additive that you can predict reaction times to we call it a 2-dimensional task, just simply by convolving reaction time distributions from the 1-dimensional margins. It's strikingly compelling.
Cool. Well, why don't we move on, because we have lots of questions, but we can stay in the same theme. So Maisha asked, for the SPRT, would you have to know which 2 distributions you're picking from beforehand? What happens if you try to pick between 2 distributions that the data doesn't actually come from? This is a great question. Who wants to give it a go? Maybe Anne's dog? And your dog's having a great time back there.
Yeah, I'll leave this one for Mike.
So this is, okay, I love this question because first of all, it's a brilliant question. So thank you, whoever you are, Maisha. It's the whole, as you say, the assumption of SPRT is that you know the mapping between a sample of evidence and log likelihood ratio, okay, or just log likelihood, okay? So, and when that is not true, then the assumptions behind SPRT are violated. And it turns out that one way that that's not true is someone didn't tell you the strength of the evidence that they were giving you, the reliability of the evidence. Say in a motion test, they didn't tell you the motion coherence, the strength of the evidence. And in that situation, you can still sample as if you know something, which is that you can assume that evidence, because it's a difference variable, the momentary evidence is proportional to its own log likelihood ratio. It's a bizarre thing, but what I'm saying is, a sample of a difference variable is proportional to the log of the likelihood ratio under the two hypotheses under consideration. You don't know what the constant of proportionality is, but you know that it is that holds. And one of the ways, if you guys did SPRT, is I don't know if you did this, but if you derive that the psychometric function is logistic, that's a way of saying that partial accumulations are proportional to log likelihood ratios. Anyway, so that led, it's a cool historical point where normative theory led to the people tossed out the SPRT and diffusion to bound, or we used to call them absorbing Markov chain models, because they made a very specific prediction about how error reaction time should work. That prediction was tested and it was falsified, and people just threw out that whole class of models until Roger Radcliffe effectively resurrected it. And he resurrected it with a bunch of parameters that I think are not appropriate, actually. I think he misparameterizes that version of the drift diffusion model, which is probably the one that most people use. But at the same time, what turns out to be the case is that because you don't know the mapping from unit of evidence, a sample, in other words, to log likelihood ratio, well, all you really need to do is accumulate anyway and have a bound and let that bound collapse. The two bounds collapse. Oh, they can see us, right? They collapse as a function of time, okay? And that just means that you're willing to accept less evidence as time goes by, and that explains why reaction times are longer on error trials. Anyway, this is probably maybe too much weeds, but you're absolutely right to question whether or not whether you can do something when you don't know that information, the mapping, and yet you can get away with something very beautiful by applying it anyway.
So let's switch gears a little bit. We've had a great conversation about SBRT and the DDM. Nathan Brantley asked the question, are the number of states in the HMM analogous to the number of clusters in a Gaussian mixture model? GMMs do not incorporate temporal information, but I'm curious about the parallels between these models. So this is a quick question to answer, but I think it's nice that you picked up on it. So the Gaussian mixture model is actually a special case of the hidden Markov model. And the special case is if the columns of the transition matrix are identical, which means that every state, it doesn't matter where you are to guess what the next data point is. And that's the same as saying there's no temporal information between data points. So if you had a transition matrix where all the columns were identical, then those columns would be the same as the mixture probabilities for the Gaussian in the Gaussian mixture model, and that would be the connection there. Maisha asked another question on the hidden Markov model. Does the relationship between X and the hidden X and observable Y need to be fairly simple? For example, in the first section, it just seemed to be Y of X was X plus noise. Any takers on that one? Pascal, I thought you might want to jump on that.
Yeah, define simple. Do you mean linear?
Well, in this case, it looks like it's the identity plus noise, but I guess
that's right. That is very simple. That is the identity plus noise. Yeah. So yeah, that will be. Yeah, I think it can be a little bit more complicated than that, right?
Yeah, I mean, my sense of it is that in a hidden Markov model, the state dependence can be totally, the noise model in a given state can be totally different from state to state. So there's actually this kind of, there isn't necessarily a linear dependence on the data or any clear dependence other than that you have a different noise model in the different states. So that you can think that the parameters of your data generating distribution, your noise distribution, could be different from state to state, but you don't need to have this kind of connection where somehow there's a clear link between the data and the state, like in this equation. All right, why don't we go back up to the top here? So Charlotte asks, this is an interesting question about what do you do when you have a population of subjects and you fit models to each subject? How do we compare them?
Can you flesh out the question a little more?
Yeah, my sense is she asked specifically with respect to an HMM, but I think this could be also applicable to any of the other models that we're discussing. So imagine you have, I'm thinking about it, imagine you have two rats and you fit the parameters of the DDM to both rats. Then how do you sort of say what's different and the same about them? How do we compare those models? What is fitting the model to the different subjects help us learn about their different behavior and maybe the similarities between their behavior? That's my take on the question anyway.
If I would, Athena, were you going to say something?
Go ahead. I can add the end.
Well, I was just going to say that it just touches on a larger issue, which is identifiability and parameter recovery. So, you know, the problem with a lot of these models, and definitely the highly parameterized drift diffusion models, are mostly not recoverable in my experience. And so, but if you do have a model that is A, recoverable, that is hypothesis A versus hypothesis B, for example, will end up, you know, when you simulate data based using the parameters and realistic assumptions of the noise, which is all pretty much of a black art in some sense. But when you do that, if you can do that, that's fine. That's passing the level 1 muster. But then the question is, how can you recover parameters, and with what reliability? And you know, that's a good test. And if you can recover parameters with very small confidence intervals or equivalent thereof, you're using Bayesian methods, then you're in a position where you might be able to say that this subject seems to have a different setting for this particular parameter than another. Problem is that in a lot of these models, parameters can chase each other around. And my starting assumption is that we never have the right model. And since we never have the right model, it's very hard to take too seriously the particular parameter that you decided to focus on. But that's philosophy, really.
I think it touches on a very important point, though, which is, you know, do we want to believe the specific parameters of a model, or do we want to use them more for qualitative understanding of underlying principles and properties? Okay, so here's another question from Charlotte. Is it possible to use such models in a multi-feature setting? For example, brain connectivity time series between different areas to capture multidimensional dynamics. So I'm thinking this question is related to, can we use these hidden state models to understand the connectivity between different brain regions?
Oh.
That's at least my quick take on that question.
I don't know the answer to that. It's a really interesting question. I think right now we kind of have a shortage of tools to really evaluate what's happening across areas, especially when there are population recordings in both areas. I don't know of work that's used hidden states to do that. I don't know if other people do.
I think what most people de facto do is, if they have highly multivariate data, they do a PCA or something like that first to get a low dimensional state space, and then see how that moves around in that state space, right?
That's a little bit related to like the communication subspace analysis that was developed by I guess Adam Cohn and Byron Yu and a few other people, looking at what time varying activity patterns in one area, in their case V1, are actually transmitted to V2, and which other time varying activity patterns are kind of private to V1. And of course, you can do that analysis both within areas and across areas, and so on. It's sort of a little bit what you're describing, I think, Pascal.
I think that so I don't know of papers that have looked at this specific question, the context of, say, something like an HMM, but it is a really interesting potential idea. So imagine you had recordings in two different areas. One version of a hidden state could be if area A is listening to area B, or when area A is listening to area B. And you could potentially use this kind of model to infer that. And maybe if you compare that to behavior, that could give you some insights about different kinds of switching. Okay. So folks, we're getting close to the end. So maybe we'll just do another question, and then have some reflections from folks on the panel. So Nikte asks, how do we know how much noise is acceptable to implement a functional HMM with good results, taking into account that the biological systems are always kind of noisy? So I think we talked about this a little bit, but when is too much noise in the data too much? Is that a question we can answer?
I think it depends on the use case. If you want to build a BMI, then it depends, for instance, like if you can deliver what you need to deliver, right? What noise is acceptable if you want to build a brain-machine interface, no? Where if you have a scientific question, improving at all might be better than nothing, right? Accounting for some of it, as Anne said earlier, I think this morning, we don't really account for that much of the variance, but it's better than nothing, right?
Actually, I don't remember.
Maybe we'll, before we move on to some final wrap-up thoughts, there's one.
As Mike was also saying, that we usually we would like to recover parameters of our models right from that noisy data, and we usually build some confidence interval around that, and it really, the amount of noise that is tolerable, it really depends on the context. It depends on the number of parameters we are trying to estimate, and then how big the confidence interval will come out at the end after we look into the data and the parameters.
How correlated they are and so forth. Right? So.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, exactly. How correlated they are.
Definitely.
Let's actually answer one more question. So Vasishta asks, how do we, if I have a time series data, how do I know that there could be hidden states or latent states? What does it mean for any observable data for there to be hidden states? So if you collect a data set, what's the process that might lead you to one of these kinds of models from just the initial experiment?
I have a philosophical remark on that.
Yeah, let's.
I also have a philosophical remark. I have, probably our philosophical remarks are a little bit different, Mike. Mine is pretty trivial, but it's something that we forget about it a lot of times. I mean, I think even hearing a simple sound and then recording from A1 neurons, auditory cortex neurons, and looking at the responses of neurons in response to this sound, they are actually, we don't know what is, they are responding to some sort of a hidden state, because what we are receiving in our sensory organ, in our hair cells in the air, are just these kind of vibrations of air vibrations, sound pressure level is going to be transferred into some sort of electrical pulses, and then it's going through these mechanical sensors, and that is going to travel up and then fires some neurons in A1. And then we think that neuron is responding to, for instance, frequency, or like if you're playing some Q tone, whether it's 2 kilohertz or 3 kilohertz. But in reality, they are actually, they are abstracting out some sort of a hidden variable, some latent state from this complex sensory stimulation, and they are responding to that. But even in that simple setting, we never really talk about that. We didn't always say that A1 neurons are responding to sound frequency. But what is sound frequency? There are a lot of layers in between to transfer these physical sensation into firing data. And so I think most of the processes in the brain are actually in response some sort of a latent state that sometimes it's very kind of intuitive to link those into some actual experiences in outside world, and sometimes it gets more complicated if we are thinking about like more cognitive tasks and combination of sensory inputs with our memory, with our various sources of internal knowledge.
Yeah, I really like that answer. And when I was just thinking while you were talking that you could just think of all of the sensory brain as being involved in inferring hidden states about the world. If the photoreceptor activity patterns on our retina are not informative in their raw form, right? You need to have some inference of that activity to get some meaning about the world. Okay, Mike, you want to say something here?
Yeah, just because it's philosophical, and it's in a sense it parallels how we should think about the brain and how we should think about doing experiments. So I'm a strong believer that knowledge is the answers to our interrogations. So it is true that we make serendipitous discovery, of the unexpected, and there I think this question is extremely pertinent as written. That it's what about the data would make you think that there were different clusters in different states or states within states, and those are the kinds of things like that that led Anne to discover this movement related signal. But that's because there's some knowledge about how noise works and the time scale in an area, and then there's this other stuff going on, and so it's surprising. Well, what was it for? And she figures that out. Okay, but for the most part, I think we find things. As Sherlock Holmes said, when Watson asked him, "How did you find that?" He said, "Well, I knew where to look." And I think that it's a really bad idea to think that big data will give us the answers through machine learning. No, we get the answers from data because we collect the data with a question in mind, and then the data give us the answers. And guess what? That's how the brain works too. This is the big ruse in neural networks, that we throw some data at something and we categorize it. No, the brain asks questions of the world and then gets answers in a limited data set that was actually directed and interrogated. And that's how knowledge forms in the organic brain, not the artificial ones.
Shawn.
Right. Yeah,
Shawn,
Pascal.
I know people will be shocked to hear this, but I actually agree with Mike. People say data speak for itself. But I disagree, they don't. Data has no voice. You have to give it a voice by questions. And as Mike said, the organism asks questions about the world, it's curious.
So knowledge is the consequence of interrogation. That's a pretty nice mantra.
Right.
Final thoughts?
Yes.
Go for it.
So I also have a philosophical point to make, and this is a request from
Short
Tara.
final thoughts.
What? Yeah. Philosophical final thoughts. So this is for Tara. Is Tara still here? So hang on, this was upon request. Can you see that? So here we go. All right, there we go. I guess it's there. But yes, so the philosophical point is that you are the Kalman filter. Like, I mean, you have to understand that you are in the same situation. Like all your past life, all the things that happened to you got you to your current state. Your current state is integrating all of that. And now you're taking in new measurements, and now you have to make decisions under uncertainty going forward. So you are the Kalman filter. That is my parting philosophical thought. This is for Tara specifically.
Okay. All right. Without Kalman's consent, or anyway?
No, Kalman's dead.
No, I have no final thoughts. That was really fun, you guys. It was really a pleasure to be on this panel with all of you. And thanks so much to all the attendees for the fantastic questions. That was great.
All right, Athena?
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Okay, all right. Well, I think that's us. Mike, you had already got your chance. So that's us signing off. Thanks a lot. This is really a great conversation. I appreciate everyone in the panel for joining and all the students. And I hope you guys really enjoyed your day today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the next week and a half.
Indeed. All right, so see you guys.
Bye, Mike.